England, 1347. The autumn rain drummed against the stone walls of St. Bartholomew's as Father Thomas Whitmore knelt before the altar, his evening prayers interrupted by the heavy oak doors groaning open. Candlelight flickered across worn stone as footsteps echoed through the nave, measured, deliberate, belonging to someone accustomed to command. Thomas had been expecting this moment for weeks now, though he had tried to convince himself otherwise. The watching eyes he'd felt during his morning walks through the Abbey gardens, the strange dreams that left him gasping and ashamed in his narrow cot, the way his hands trembled when he raised the communion chalice, all of it had been building to this. He rose slowly, brushing dust from his rough woolen habit, and turned to face his unexpected visitor. The man who approached moved with the fluid grace of nobility, his dark cloak sodden from the storm, expensive leather boots silent on the ancient stones. When he lowered his hood, Thomas found himself staring into eyes the color of winter sky, pale blue and infinitely cold, yet burning with something that made the priest's breath catch in his throat. The stranger was perhaps 30 years of age, with the sharp beauty of a fallen angel. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at his collar, and his mouth, God help him, that mouth, was carved with lines that spoke of both cruelty and breathtaking sensuality. Everything about him whispered of danger, of roads that led away from salvation. "Father," the stranger said, his voice cultured, bearing the refined accent of court, each word was precisely enunciated, as if he were used to being obeyed without question. "I seek confession." Thomas studied the man's face, those sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, a jaw that spoke of stubborn will, and that unsettling gaze that seemed to see straight through the priest's carefully maintained composure. The man's presence filled the sacred space like incense, heavy and intoxicating. "Of course, my son." Thomas gestured toward the confessional booth in the shadow of the nave, desperate to put some barrier between them. "Though it grows late, and the storm." "I prefer to confess here," the man interrupted, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face, "in the light, before God and his servant." There was something in his tone, possession perhaps, or the certainty of a man who had never been denied, that made Thomas's skin prickle with warning. But he had sworn an oath to minister to all souls, regardless of their sins or the danger they posed to his own peace of mind. "As you wish. I am Father Whitmore. What name shall I call you?" A smile ghosted across the stranger's lips, beautiful and terrible, like the angel Lucifer might have worn before his fall. "Edmund, Lord Edmund Ashworth, though I suspect you know that name already." Thomas's blood ran cold. He did indeed know that name. The Ashworth lands bordered the Abbey's holdings, and whispers of their lord's reputation had reached even these sacred walls. A man of violence and vice, they said, a wolf in nobleman's clothing who took what he wanted without regard for God's law or man's law. There were rumors of duels fought over slights both real and imagined, of servants who vanished after displacing him, of appetites that ran to the forbidden and the blasphemous. "Very well, Lord Ashworth." Thomas fought to keep his voice steady. "What brings you to seek God's mercy this night?" Edmund moved closer, eight-step deliberate and predatory, close enough now that Thomas could smell the rain on his cloak, the expensive oils in his hair, the subtle scent of bergamot, and something darker, sandalwood perhaps, or cedar. When he knelt suddenly on the cold stone, Thomas instinctively stepped back, but Edmund's hand shot out with serpentine quickness, fingers closing around the priest's wrist with surprising gentleness. The touch burned like a brand, and Thomas had to bite back a gasp at the contact. How long had it been since anyone had touched him? Years, perhaps. The lonely life of a country priest allowed for few such comforts. "I am tormented, Father," Edmund said, his voice barely above a whisper, intimate as a lover's confession in the darkness. "Consumed by desires that damn my very soul." Thomas tried to pull away, but Edmund's grip tightened, not painfully, but with the inexorable strength of a man who would not be denied. "My son, please, you must release me. This is not proper." "Do you know what it is to burn, Father Whitmore?" Edmund's eyes lifted to meet his, and Thomas saw raw hunger there that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a caged bird. To be consumed by want so fierce it feels like holy fire running through your veins? To lie awake each night praying for deliverance that never comes? Lord Ashworth, you must... "I dream of you," Edmund said simply. The words hung in the air between them like a blade poised to fall. Thomas went very still, his training warring with the sudden heat that bloomed in his chest. This was temptation, pure and simple, the devil's own snare laid before him. That is impossible," Thomas managed. "We have never met." Edmund rose slowly, never releasing Thomas's wrist. The priest was tall, but Edmund was taller. Broader through the shoulders, built like a man who had spent his life wielding sword and shield. "Haven't we? I've watched you, Father, from the forest when you tend your garden, through the windows when you say Mass. You move like a dancer, did you know? All grace and unconscious beauty." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face, the watching eyes, the sense of being observed. It had not been his imagination after all. This is madness. You speak of sin." "Yes." Edmund's free hand lifted to trace the air near Thomas's cheek, not quite touching, but close enough that Thomas could feel the heat radiating from his palm. "Mortal sin. The kind that burns souls to ash and sends men screaming into the pit. And yet I cannot stop myself." Thomas finally wrenched free, stumbling backwards until his shoulders hit the altar. The cold stone was a shock against his spine, grounding him in the reality of where he stood in God's house before God's altar, with his vows lying heavy on his shoulders like chains. "You mock the sacred bonds of this place." The words came out stronger than he felt. "My vows?" "Your vows." Edmund advanced again, predatory and patient like a hunting cat. "Tell me, Father Whitmore, when you kneel in prayer each morning until your knees bleed on the stone, do you never feel the ache of loneliness? When you tend the sick and dying and they grasp your hands in gratitude, do their touches not linger in your memory? When you dream in your narrow bed, are your dreams always of heaven?" "Stop!" Thomas's voice cracked like a boy's. "This is temptation. You are the devil himself sent to test me." Edmund laughed, the sound rich and dark like communion wine. "Perhaps I am, but even devils can love, Thomas. Even devils can burn with wanting. May I call you Thomas?" The use of its Christian means sent a shock through the priest's system like lightning striking a church steeple. "No, you may not." "Thomas," Edmund said again, tasting the name like honey on his tongue. "Do you know why I came here tonight? Why I brave excommunication and eternal damnation to kneel before you in this holy place? Against every instinct, every prayer hammered done to him during his years of training, Thomas found himself asking, why? Because I am already damned. Have been since the moment I saw you blessing the harvest 3 months past. Do you remember that day? You stood in that field of golden wheat with the sun in your hair like a halo, your face turned towards heaven, and I knew I would trade my immortal soul for one touch, one kiss, one night in your arms. The memory hit Thomas like a physical blow. He did remember that day, the warmth of the sun on his face, the sense of God's presence strong around him as he blessed the grain that would feed the village through winter. He had felt watched then,
but had attributed it to the natural curiosity of the farmers and their families. "You cannot say such things," Thomas whispered, pressing himself harder against the altar. The carved stone bit into his back through his rough habit. "Not here. Not to me. Where else would I say them?" Edmund was close now. Close enough that Thomas could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body like a forge fire. "To whom else would I confess this love that is killing me by degrees? I have tried, Thomas. God knows I have tried to forget you." Edmund's voice dropped to a whisper, intimate and desperate. "I buried myself in wine until I couldn't stand, lost myself in the bodies of others, men and women both, anyone who might drive your face from my dreams. I rode my horses until they foamed at the mouth, hunted until the servants begged me to rest, fought duels with any man fool enough to give me cause. Nothing touches this fire you've lit in me." "It is not love," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It is obsession, sickness of the mind." "Is it?" Edmund raised one hand again, and this time his fingers did touch Thomas's cheek. Feather light, reverent as a prayer. "Then why do you not wool away? Why does your breath quicken when I speak your name? Why do your eyes follow me, even as your lips speak of sin?" Thomas realized with dawning horror that he was right. Despite every vow, every prayer, every desperate plea to God for strength, he stood frozen under Edmund's touch like a deer before the hunter's arrow. Worse, he was leaning into that touch, his body betraying him even as his mind screamed warnings. Thomas's voice failed him. "I have watched you struggle with loneliness, Thomas, seen you pray for deliverance from wants you dare not name. Did you think you were so well hidden? Did you think God would not test even his most faithful servants?" Edmund's thumb traced the sharp line of Thomas's cheekbone, and the priest felt his knees threaten to buckle. When had anyone last touched him with such reverence? When had he last felt truly seen, truly wanted, truly alive? "This is wrong," Thomas breathed, but he did not move away. "Yes," Edmund agreed, his voice rough with desire. "Gloriously, damnably wrong. And yet here we stand, and I cannot find it in myself to repent." The candles guttered in a sudden draft from the storm outside, throwing wild shadows across the walls. In the dancing light, Edmund's face looked like something from an illuminated manuscript. Beautiful and terrible. Angel and demon combined in one impossible form. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked, though he feared the answer. "Everything," Edmund said without hesitation. "Your body, your heart, your very soul. I want to worship you as I should worship God, on my knees, with reverence and awe. I want to know every prayer that falls from your lips, every sigh, every tremor of pleasure. I want to teach you what it means to be adored." Thomas closed his eyes, but that only made Edmund's presence more intense. The warmth of his breath, the subtle scent of expensive oils and rain-washed leather, and the almost electric feeling of standing on the precipice of the unthinkable. "I cannot," Thomas whispered. "My vows were made by a boy who had never known desire. You're a man now, Thomas, a man with a man's needs and a man's heart. Why should you live and die alone for a God who made you capable of this very love you deny?" Thomas's eyes snapped open. "God made me to serve him." "Did he? Or did men tell you that was God's will?" Edmund's other hand came up to frame Thomas's face, holding him gently but firmly. "Look at me, Thomas. Look into my eyes and tell me you feel nothing. Tell me this is not the answer to every prayer you never dared to speak." Thomas looked, and it was like staring into the sun. Everything in him yearned towards this man, this dangerous, impossible, beautiful man who spoke heresy like poetry and looked at him as if you were something precious beyond all earthly treasure. "I feel," Thomas struggled for words, his throat tight with unshed tears. "I feel as if I am dying." "You are," Edmund said softly. "The boy you were, the safe creature hiding behind vows and prayers. He is dying. The question is, what will be born in his place?" Before Thomas could answer, Edmund leaned forward and brushed his lips across the priest's face, gentle as a benediction, burning as a brand. Thomas gasped, his hands flying up to grasp Edmund's shoulders. He meant to push him away. Instead, his fingers curled into the rich fabric of the nobleman's tunic, pulling him closer. "Thomas," Edmund whispered against his temple, the priest's name a prayer on his lips. "My beautiful, tormented priest, let me save you from this cold sanctuary. Let me show you what it means to be alive." Thomas was drowning. 28 years of discipline, of denial, of kneeling on cold stone until his knees bled. All of it crumbling under the simple weight of being wanted, of being seen not as a vessel for God's will, but as a man worth desiring, worth risking damnation for. "If I," Thomas's voice broke like a young man at prayer, "if I fall completely. There will be no going back and no redemption." Edmund smiled, and it was radiant as sunrise after the longest night. "Then let us fall together and find our own kind of grace." The kiss, when it came, was nothing like Thomas had imagined in his darkest moments of weakness. It was not rough or demanding, but achingly gentle. Edmund's lips moving against his with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Thomas felt himself melting, his carefully constructed walls crumbling like sand before the tide. When they broke apart, both men were breathing hard. Thomas stared up into Edmund's face, seeing his own wonder and care reflected in those winter blue eyes. "What have we done?" Thomas whispered. "Nothing yet," Edmund said fiercely, his hand still framing Thomas's face. "The choice is still yours, my love. I will not take what you are not ready to give freely." Thomas looked around the church, at the altar where he had knelt in prayer every morning for 6 years, at the cross that had witnessed his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, at the confessional where he had absolved countless souls of the very sin he now contemplated. Everything looked different now, as if he were seeing it through new eyes. The shadows seemed deeper, the candlelight warmer, the very air charged with possibility. "I have loved God all my life," he said slowly. Edmund's face fell, but he nodded with quiet dignity. "I know, and I would not ask you to stop. But I have never loved a man, never allowed myself to want what other men want. I thought such feelings were weakness, temptation to be overcome through prayer and penance. And now," Thomas reached up to touch Edmund's face, marveling at the contrast between sharp bone and warm skin, at the way that pale eyes fluttered closed at his touch. "Now, I think perhaps God made me capable of this love for a reason. Perhaps he does not wish me to die alone and untouched, having never known the joy he placed in my heart." Edmund's breath hitched. "Thomas!"
"I am terrified," Thomas confessed, "of my bishop, of my God, of my own heart. But I am more terrified of never knowing what it means to be loved by you." Edmund caught Thomas's hand, pressing it flat against his cheek. "Then you will come with me?" Thomas looked once more around the church that had been his world. When his gaze fell on the crucifix above the altar, he expected to feel shame, condemnation, the weight of divine displeasure. Instead, he felt only a deep, surprising peace, as if God himself was nodding in quiet approval. "Where will we go?" he asked. "Away from here. To the continent, perhaps. Florence or Venice, where gold speaks louder than gossip, and 2 men can live as they choose, love as they choose." Edmund's eyes were bright with hope and desperate longing. "I have wealth enough to buy us a new life, a clean start where no one knows Father Thomas Whitmore or Lord Edmund Ashworth." Thomas thought of his small cell behind the sacristy, his meager possessions, the routine that had shaped his days for so many years. And then he thought of waking beside Edmund, of learning to love without shame, of finally living instead of merely existing in the shadows of other men's lives. "I will need time," he said,
to arrange things, to speak with Brother Francis about the parish records, to say goodbye. Edmund finished gently. I understand. How long? A week, perhaps two. There are things I must set in order, people I must... Edmund silenced him with another kiss, deeper this time, more urgent. When they parted, Thomas was gasping. However long it takes, Edmund said, resting his forehead against the priest's. I will wait. A week, a month, a year. I will wait for you until the end of the world if need be. They stood in silence for a moment, the magnitude of what they were planning settling over them like a cloak. Thomas had expected to feel guilt, terror at his apostasy. Instead, he felt only a growing sense of rightness, as if he were finally walking the path he was meant to walk. Will you stay tonight? Thomas asked suddenly, surprising himself with his boldness. The storm, it would be dangerous to ride in such weather. Edmund's eyes darkened with something that made Thomas's pulse quicken. If you wish it, if you're certain. I do. I am. Thomas's voice grew stronger. I do not want to be alone anymore. I have been alone for so very long. Edmund's smile was like sunrise after the longest winter. Nor I, my love, nor I. As the storm raged outside, they made their way through the darkened church toward Thomas's modest quarters behind the sacristy. With each step, Thomas felt the weight of his old life falling away like discarded robes. He was no longer Father Whitmore, servant of God and keeper of sacred vows. He was simply Thomas, a man walking toward love with his heart in his throat and his hand in that of the person who had shown him what it meant to be truly, desperately, and beautifully alive. Behind them the candles burned low, casting long shadows across the altar. And if God had opinions about what transpired in the small chamber that night, about the gentle way Edmund undressed his priest, about the tears Thomas wept as he was kissed and touched and worshipped like the sacred thing he was, he kept them to himself, perhaps understanding, as only a father could, that some kinds of love were too precious to condemn, even when they bloomed in the most forbidden of gardens. 2 weeks later, the village would awake to find St. Bartholomew's empty, its priests vanish in the night like morning mist. Some were to say he had been called to serve in distant lands. Others whispered of darker possibilities, of temptation and fall from grace, of bargains made with dark powers. But in the markets of Florence, months later, travelers will tell tales of two Englishmen who had taken lodgings near the cathedral. One was clearly noble-born, with the bearing of a lord and the manner of a man deeply in love. The other was quieter, gentler, a scholar perhaps, or a former monk who had found a different kind of calling. They were devoted to each other in a way that even the worldly Italians pause and smile. The former priest had taken to translating religious texts into the vernacular. Beautiful, illuminated works that breathe with passion and divine love. His companion funded these endeavors with the wealth of his former estate, sold quietly through intermediaries. They called each other Thomas and Edmund, and lived as men who had found their salvation not in prayers and penance, but in the dangerous miracle of being truly known by another soul. And if sometimes Thomas woke from dreams of candlelit altars and whispered confessions, Edmund was always there to remind him that some sins are worth the price of heaven, especially when they led to a different kind of paradise altogether, built not of gold and harps, but of shared mornings and gentle touches and the radical act of choosing love or fear. The end.
Appreciate you watching. Hit subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next story.